April 8, 1942, the Egyptian desert near Ghazala, Libya. British gunners of the 2nd Battalion, the Rifle Brigade, crouched behind their newly delivered anti-tank guns, watching German panzer columns advancing through the shimmering heat. These men had spent the previous year fighting with 2-pounder guns that bounced harmlessly off German armour. They had watched friends die because their weapons couldn't stop enemy tanks. Now, they had something different. The Ordnance quick-firing 6-pounder, a 57mm gun that would arrive just in time to face Rommel's greatest offensive. What these gunners didn't know, what none of the British soldiers sweating in the North African sun could have imagined, was that they were manning the weapon that would knock out the first Tiger tanks, dominated El Alamein, and remain in service for 2 decades after the war ended. The 6-pounder would transform from a gun that almost wasn't built into the most successful British anti-tank weapon of the Second World War. The story begins not in 1942, but in 1938, when British ordnance experts at Woolwich Arsenal realised their newest anti-tank gun was already obsolete. The 2-pounder, adopted in 1936, could penetrate 42mm of armour at 1,000 yards. This made it one of the world's best anti-tank guns when introduced. By 1940, German tank development had left it hopelessly behind. Reports from France made the situation clear. The Matilda infantry tanks, virtually immune to German guns, could destroy enemy armour with impunity. But British anti-tank guns were useless against the new German Panzer Mark III's and V's. Something had to be done. The Woolwich Arsenal team, led by experienced designers who had worked on naval ordnance, chose a 57mm calibre. This wasn't arbitrary. The Royal Navy had used 57mm guns since the late 19th century. Manufacturing equipment existed. Tooling could be adapted. Most importantly, a 57mm gun could fire a projectile weighing approximately 6 pounds, giving it tremendous armour-piercing capability while remaining man-portable. The design was complete by 1940, a conventional 2-wheeled split-trail carriage with pneumatic tyres. No spring suspension to keep weight down. The gun itself was a masterpiece of engineering simplicity. The barrel could recoil 30 inches along its cradle after firing, absorbed by a hydro-pneumatic recuperator. The breech mechanism was rugged and reliable. Elevation ranged from -5 degrees to +15 degrees. Traverse was 45 degrees left and right with the split trail deployed. The gun could even be fired with the trails closed for emergency situations. Everything was ready for production. Then came Dunkirk. The evacuation from France in May and June 1940 left the British Expeditionary Force stripped of equipment. Nearly 600 anti-tank guns abandoned in France, artillery pieces left behind, thousands of vehicles lost. The threat of German invasion loomed over Britain like a thundercloud. The War Office faced an impossible choice: start producing the new 6-pounder, requiring months to retool factories and retrain crews, or continue manufacturing the 2-pounder with existing equipment and trained workers. The mathematics were brutal. It was estimated that producing 100 6-pounders would displace the production of 600 2-pounders. With German invasion barges gathering across the Channel, Britain needed numbers. The decision was made: keep producing the 2-pounder. The 6-pounder would wait. Production finally began in November 1941, a full year after the design was completed. The first guns entered service in May 1942, just in time for Rommel's offensive at Ghazala. The delay would prove catastrophic for British tank crews who spent 1941 fighting with inadequate weapons. But by the spring of 1942, the 6-pounder was finally reaching the troops who desperately needed it. The MKZ-2 variant, the first mass production model, featured a shorter L43 barrel. This wasn't the originally planned length. There was a critical shortage of suitable lathes capable of machining longer barrels. The British industrial base, stretched thin by years of war production, simply couldn't produce enough machines to make the longer barrels in quantity. The shorter barrel reduced muzzle velocity slightly, but the gun remained effective. The 6-pounder was a substantial weapon. Empty weight was 2,520 pounds, over 100 kilograms. This was more than twice the weight of the 2-pounder. Moving it required 6 men as a gun crew, plus a towing vehicle. The British used various trucks and carriers. The gun could be broken down for transport, though this took time. For the crews who had struggled with the inadequate 2-pounder, the 6-pounder was revelation and burden in equal measure. Yes, it could actually kill German tanks. But it was heavy, difficult to conceal and took longer to bring into action. The standard ammunition load was 50 to 60 rounds per gun, carried separately. Each armour-piercing round weighed 6.28 pounds, the propellant another 2 pounds. Resupply was a constant challenge in the fluid warfare of North Africa. The gun's performance was impressive for 1942. Firing the standard armour-piercing shot, the 6-pounder had a muzzle velocity of 2,693 feet per second. Maximum range was 5,500 yards, though effective anti-tank range was much shorter. At 1,000 yards, the standard AP shot could penetrate 74 millimeters of armour. This was enough to defeat the frontal armour of any German tank in service in early 1942. The Panzer III had 50 millimeters of frontal armour. The Panzer IV had 50 millimeters as well. Even the up-armoured variants with additional plates could be penetrated at combat ranges. For the first time since France fell, British gunners had a weapon that could stop German armour. The gun first saw action at the Battle of Gazala in May 1942. Over 100 guns were available when Rommel launched Operation Venezia, his offensive to capture Tobruk and drive into Egypt. The German plan was audacious, a diversionary attack in the north while the main force, including the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions, along with Italian armour, swept around the southern end of the Gazala line. The Afrika Korps would appear behind British positions, cutting supply lines and destroying the 8th Army in detail. Rommel had done this before. The British had reason to fear, but this time they had the 6-pounder. When German tanks encountered the first 6-pounders, the result surprised both sides. Panzer crews accustomed to bouncing shots off their frontal armour suddenly found themselves under effective fire at ranges they considered safe. Tank after tank erupted in flames as 6-pounder rounds punched through armour that had seemed invincible. German after-action reports noted with alarm that British anti-tank guns had significantly improved. Intelligence officers scrambled to identify the new weapon. For British gunners, the experience was equally startling. After months of firing at German tanks with weapons that might as well have been throwing rocks, they were actually destroying targets. Morale soared. Confidence returned. The gun worked. But Gazala was ultimately a German victory. Rommel's tactical brilliance and the superior training of German forces overcame British advantages in numbers and equipment. The 8th Army was forced to retreat. Tobruk, which had held out for 8 months in 1941, fell after a single day's fighting in June 1942. Rommel was promoted to Field Marshal. The road to Egypt seemed open. The 6-pounders had performed well, destroying numerous German tanks. But good equipment couldn't compensate for poor tactics and inadequate leadership. The British retreat continued to El Alamein, where Auchinleck finally managed to halt the German advance. The critical test of the 6-pounder would come at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. Montgomery had taken command of the 8th Army, replacing the exhausted Auchinleck. New tanks were arriving, including American Shermans and Grants. New tactics were being developed, and the 6-pounder guns were being distributed throughout the army. In the Royal Artillery anti-tank regiments, each battery had 12 guns. Infantry battalions received their own 6-pounder platoons for close defence. The gun was everywhere. On the night of October 26, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Victor Turner led the 2nd Battalion, the Rifle Brigade, on what should have been a straightforward mission. His unit, part of the 7th Motor Brigade, was ordered to occupy a small depression in the desert known as Snipe. This feature, barely noticeable in the flat landscape, would serve as a jumping-off point for the 24th Armoured Brigade's advance the following morning. Turner's force consisted of approximately 300 men, 19 6-pounder anti-tank guns from his own battalion and the attached 239th Battery, and a small number of carriers and scout vehicles. They advanced through darkness and dust, navigating by compass bearing in conditions that made precision impossible. At dawn, Turner discovered they had occupied the wrong position. They were 900 yards south of the intended location, in a depression that was smaller and more exposed than expected. Worse, they were surrounded. As the sun rose and visibility improved, scouts reported German and Italian tank formations lagered nearby. The Germans called these overnight positions Lager, from the Afrikaans word for camp. Tanks would circle up, crews would rest, maintenance would be performed. The 2nd Rifle Brigade had inadvertently placed themselves in the middle of multiple enemy armoured formations. Turner had to make a decision: withdraw and expose his force to certain destruction in daylight, or stay and hope for the best. He chose to stay. At 6:15 a.m., German tank columns began moving. Kampfgruppe Stiffelmeier, part of the 15th Panzer Division, broke lager and began forming up. The tanks moved west, away from the front line, apparently repositioning for the day's fighting. This exposed their side and rear armour to the hidden British guns. The 6-pounder crews dug into shallow pits in the sandy depression, waited. Range was approximately 800 yards. Perfect. The order to fire came simultaneously from multiple gun commanders. 19 6-pounders opened up at once. Sergeant Charles Calistan, commanding one of the guns facing the German column, watched his first shot strike a Panzer IV in the side. The tank lurched, then exploded as ammunition cooked off. He fired again. Another hit, another kill. 5 more armour-piercing rounds in rapid succession destroyed 5 more German tanks before the range opened. In the first 30 minutes of fighting, the guns of Outpost Snipe destroyed 16 enemy tanks. 8 Panzer IV, 6 Italian M1340 medium tanks, and 2 Semoventi self-propelled guns simply ceased to exist. The German tankers had no idea where the fire was coming from. The British guns were perfectly concealed in the depression. Muzzle flashes were hard to spot in the morning sun, the carnage was complete. But now the British position was marked. German artillery opened fire. Shells rained down on the small depression. Dust and smoke filled the air. 3 6-pounders were knocked out in the first German response. 1 gun sank into the soft sand, unable to traverse. Casualties mounted among the gun crews. The infantry riflemen, who had been relegated to secondary roles, now became critical. Wounded gunners were replaced by riflemen who had watched the guns being operated. Mixed crews kept the remaining 16 guns in action. Throughout the day, wave after wave of German and Italian armour attacked Outpost Snipe. The Germans never determined exactly where the guns were positioned. They would advance, take catastrophic losses and withdraw. Each attack left more burning tanks littering the desert. Around 1 p.m, Italian M1340 tanks appeared from the southwest. 9 tanks supported by infantry advanced directly at the position. Only 1 6-pounder on that side of the perimeter was still operational. Lieutenant Colonel Turner himself joined the gun crew, acting as loader while Sergeant Calistan aimed. They waited until the range closed to 600 yards, then opened fire. 6 Italian tanks destroyed in rapid succession. The survivors continued advancing, apparently unaware of where the fire originated. At 300 yards, Calistan fired his last 2 rounds. 2 more kills, 3 Italian tanks remained. Lieutenant Toms, one of the officers, realised they were out of ammunition. He jumped into a jeep and raced across the open ground under machine gun fire to retrieve ammunition boxes from another position. The jeep was hit and caught fire just as he reached Turner's gun position. Toms grabbed 4 boxes of 6-pounder rounds and rolled away seconds before the vehicle exploded. The gun crew loaded the fresh ammunition and destroyed the remaining Italian tanks at point-blank range. By mid-afternoon, only 13 6-pounders remained operational. Ammunition was critically low. The British had evacuated their most seriously wounded in the remaining carriers, which had to run a gauntlet of German fire to reach friendly lines. Water was running out. Food was gone. The flies were terrible, swarming on the dead bodies of German and Italian tankers outside the perimeter. The heat was crushing. The stench of burning vehicles, cordite, and death filled the air. The situation was desperate. Then the Germans launched their final major attack. 15 Panzer IVs from a fresh formation approached from the north. These were experienced crews, and they had learned from the earlier disasters. They moved cautiously, using dead ground, trying to identify the British guns. The 6-pounder crews tracked them carefully. At 800 yards, the order to fire was given. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. 12 Panzer IVs were destroyed. Half of them caught fire immediately. 1 tank was hit simultaneously by 2 different 6-pounders, the rounds striking within milliseconds of each other. The tank disintegrated. A German officer who survived later stated in interrogation that he had never seen such concentrated and effective anti-tank fire. The remaining panzers retreated to hull-down positions and refused to advance further. As darkness fell, Turner received permission to withdraw. The 6-pounder crews disabled their remaining guns, removing sights and breech blocks. Only 1 functional gun was recovered. The men slipped away under cover of darkness, reaching British lines by midnight. The final tally at Outpost Snipe was staggering. 52 to 57 Axis tanks and armoured vehicles destroyed, depending on whose count you accepted. German records confirmed at least 52 vehicles lost. British post-battle counts found 57 wrecks around the position. The 2nd Rifle Brigade suffered 72 casualties, including killed, wounded and missing. They had lost all but one of their 6-pounders, but they had achieved one of the most successful defensive anti-tank actions of the entire war. The action at Snipe demonstrated what well-trained crews with good equipment could accomplish. The 6-pounder proved capable of destroying German armour in quantity when properly employed. But it also revealed the gun's limitations. Moving the guns under fire was nearly impossible. Once positioned, they were difficult to conceal in open desert. Resupply was problematic. Crews were exposed to artillery and machine gun fire. The gun was most effective in prepared positions where crews could wait for targets to appear at favourable ranges. Mobile warfare required different solutions. As 1942 turned into 1943, British forces began encountering new German tanks that would challenge the 6-pounder's effectiveness. On January 31, 1943, Lieutenant Stanley Edwards of the 72nd Anti-Tank Regiment found himself facing the nightmare that British intelligence had warned about. Tiger tanks. Edwards' guns were supporting the 5th Battalion of the East Kent Regiment, the Buffs, in the Rabat Valley of Tunisia. The position was somewhat exposed, but Edwards had positioned his 6-pounders to cover the obvious approach routes. When the Tigers appeared, moving down a dusty road in column formation, Edwards gave the order to fire. The first shot struck a Tiger in the side at approximately 600 yards. The round penetrated, though not catastrophically. The Tiger crew bailed out, apparently believing their tank was doomed. When British troops examined the vehicle, they found the crew had abandoned a tank that could probably have continued fighting. This was the first Tiger knocked out by Allied forces in the West, and it was a 6-pounder that did it. But Edwards and his men had no time to celebrate. More Tigers were advancing, and these crews weren't panicking. The battle became desperate. The Tiger's 88mm guns outranged the 6-pounders by a considerable margin. British guns were destroyed one by one. The surviving gunners discovered that frontal shots against the Tiger were useless. The 6-pounder simply couldn't penetrate 100mm of flat armour at combat ranges. Side and rear shots worked, if you could get them. Most crews couldn't. On April 21, 1943, another encounter with Tigers near Jebel Jaffa in Tunisia provided more data. A Tiger from the 504th Heavy Tank Battalion, Tactical No. 131, advanced through a pass with several other German tanks. Churchill tanks from the 48th Royal Tank Regiment engaged at close range with their 6-pounder guns. The gun on a Churchill was the same weapon used by towed anti-tank units, just mounted in a turret. 3 shots struck Tiger 131. The first hit the gun barrel and ricocheted into the turret ring, jamming traverse. The second hit the turret lifting lug, disabling elevation. The third struck the loader's hatch, sending fragments into the turret. The crew bailed out, leaving the tank largely intact. Tiger 131 would be captured, shipped to England, and eventually preserved at Bovington Museum, where it remains the world's only operational Tiger arm. British intelligence subjected Tiger 131 to exhaustive testing. The results were sobering. Standard 6-pounder AP shot could not penetrate the Tiger's frontal armour at any range. The 100mm front plate, even with minimal sloping, was immune. Side armour of 80mm could be penetrated, but only at favourable angles and reasonable ranges. British weapons experts concluded that the 6-pounder was marginally effective against Tigers, capable of destroying them only with flank shots or lucky hits that struck weak points. This was unacceptable. The Germans were producing Tigers in increasing numbers. Something had to be done. The solution arrived in early 1944, armour-piercing discarding sabot ammunition, APDS for short. This revolutionary round consisted of a dense tungsten carbide core surrounded by a lightweight sabot that fell away after leaving the barrel. The core, much smaller than the 57mm bore, achieved tremendous velocity. Where standard AP shot travelled at 2,693 feet per second, APDS reached over 3,900 feet per second. The increased velocity translated directly to penetration. Standard AP could penetrate 74mm at 1,000 yards. APDS could penetrate 146mm at the same range. This was transformational. Suddenly, the 6-pounder could engage Tigers frontally with reasonable chances of success. Testing showed APDS could penetrate the Tiger's 102mm lower front plate from approximately 900 meters. The 82mm turret sides could be penetrated at over 100 meters at 40-degree angles. Even the massive gun mantlet became vulnerable at closer ranges. The 6-pounder had regained effectiveness against the heaviest German armour. But there was a catch. Tungsten was critically short. Britain needed every available ounce for machine tools, tank armour, and various industrial applications. APDS production remained limited throughout 1944. Guns would receive small allocations, perhaps 5 to 10 rounds per gun. Crews were instructed to use APDS only against heavy armour that standard AP couldn't penetrate. Against regular Panzer IVs and Stuka IIIs, standard ammunition was perfectly adequate. The shortage meant APDS never became common, and many 6-pounder crews fought the entire war with only standard AP shot. By 1944, the 6-pounder was being supplemented and eventually replaced in Royal Artillery anti-tank regiments by the 17-pounder. This massive 76.2mm gun could destroy any German tank frontally at standard combat distances, but the 17-pounder weighed over 6,600 pounds, required an 8-man crew, and needed a heavy tow vehicle. In infantry battalions and airborne units, the 6-pounder remained standard equipment. For the D-Day invasion of Normandy in June 1944, both the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions of the US Army were equipped with British-manufactured 6-pounders. The Americans had adopted the gun as the 57mm M1 in 1941, but the standard US version had a longer barrel than early British models. For airborne use, the British Mk3 carriage was perfect. It was narrower, lighter, and could fit in Waco and Horsa gliders. Each airborne division received 24 guns in the anti-aircraft battalion and 9 guns per glider infantry regiment. The American paratroopers discovered what British troops had learned in 1942. The 6-pounder was an excellent gun with one critical flaw: no high explosive ammunition. The British had eventually developed an HE round, but it was largely ineffective. The 57mm caliber was simply too small to carry a useful explosive load. This severely limited the gun's versatility. Anti-tank guns spent most of their time not fighting tanks. They supported infantry attacks, knocked out machine gun positions, engaged fortifications, and suppressed enemy positions. Without effective HE ammunition, the 6-pounder was limited to its primary anti-tank role. American units in Normandy scrounged HE ammunition from British sources whenever possible, but supplies remained limited. After the breakout from Normandy, encounters with German armour became less frequent. The Wehrmacht was being pushed back, losing tanks faster than they could be replaced. American infantry units found themselves using their 57mm guns primarily against strongpoints and fortifications, roles for which they were poorly suited. By late 1944, some American regimental commanders were converting their anti-tank companies into regular rifle companies. Others sent the guns to storage and equipped their troops with bazookas instead. Losses of 57mm guns in the US First Army reached 26% in December 1944, compared to 6 to 8% monthly in Normandy. This wasn't combat loss, it was abandonment. Units simply didn't want them anymore without effective HE ammunition. British forces kept their 6-pounders in service longer, supplementing them with 17-pounders in Royal Artillery regiments, while infantry battalions retained the lighter 6-pounders. In Northwest Europe campaign, 6-pounders with APDS ammunition proved capable of destroying Panther tanks from the side and rear, though frontal engagements remained problematic. The Panther's heavily sloped frontal armour was effectively 140mm thick. Even APDS struggled. Crews learned to target the lower hull sides, where armour was thinner and vertical. A penetration here would often ignite fuel tanks or detonate ammunition. Panthers burned as readily as any other tank when hit in the right spot. The gun saw action in virtually every theatre where British forces fought. In Italy, 6-pounders provided crucial anti-tank defence during the long grinding campaign up the peninsula. In Burma, the relatively small number of 6-pounders deployed was sufficient, as Japanese armour was light and poorly protected. The 6-pounder could destroy any Japanese tank at any range. In Greece, 6-pounders supported British intervention in the Greek Civil War. In Palestine, both British forces and later Israeli units used the gun. The Israelis particularly appreciated the 6-pounder, using captured guns and later purchasing additional weapons to supplement their armour forces in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Production numbers tell the story of the 6-pounder's success. Approximately 35,000 guns were manufactured between 1941 and 1945. Britain produced the majority. Canada manufactured significant numbers for Commonwealth forces. South Africa's combined ordnance factories produced 300 guns. The United States built 4,242 of the M1 variant for both American forces and Lend-Lease. This massive production run made the 6-pounder one of the most numerous anti-tank guns of the war. Only the German Pak-38 and Soviet 45mm guns exceeded it in quantity. The gun was also mounted on numerous armoured fighting vehicles. The Churchill III and IV tanks carried the 6-pounder, as did the Valentine SS and Crusader III. The Cromwell tank was designed for the 6-pounder, but by the time it entered service in 1944, the gun had been replaced by the 75mm QF, which was essentially a rebored 6-pounder modified to fire American 75mm ammunition. This gave the same anti-tank performance with the added benefit of useful HE shells. The Centaur tank mounted the 6-pounder in some variants. The AEC armoured Car 2 carried a 6-pounder in its turret, providing mobile anti-tank capability for reconnaissance units. Several self-propelled guns used the 6-pounder. The Deacon, a 6-pounder mounted in an armoured shield on an AEC Matador truck chassis, saw limited service in North Africa. It was large, ungainly, and too easy to spot. Only 175 were built. The Valentine tank chassis was converted into the Archer tank destroyer mounting a 17-pounder, but early production used modified 6-pounders. Various experimental vehicles tested the gun, though most never reached production. The Canadians, always resourceful, mounted 6-pounders on ram tank chassis and various truck platforms. These saw limited use, mostly in training. The most successful vehicle-mounted application was simply turret-mounted guns in regular tanks. By war's end, the 6-pounder had compiled an impressive combat record. In North Africa, it had dominated from its introduction, until the arrival of Tigers and Panthers forced development of APDS ammunition. At El Alamein, 6-pounders destroyed hundreds of German and Italian tanks. Individual actions like Outpost Snipe became legendary. In Tunisia, 6-pounders knocked out the first Tigers, albeit with difficulty. In Italy, the gun remained effective against most German armour throughout the campaign. In northwest Europe, equipped with APDS, it could engage even heavy German tanks with reasonable effectiveness. Thousands of German armoured vehicles fell to 6-pounder fire between 1942 and 1945. The gun remained in British service until 1951 in infantry, battalions, and until 1960 in some units. This extraordinary longevity speaks to the fundamental soundness of the design. A weapon designed in 1938, entering service in 1942, remained effective 18 years later. Few weapon systems can claim such success. The British Army of the Rhine finally declared it obsolete in 1960, replacing it with more modern anti-tank missiles. Even then, some guns remained in service with reserve and territorial units into the early 1960s. Commonwealth nations kept their 6-pounders even longer. Canada used them into the 1960s for training. Australia retained some guns into the 1970s. Israel used 6-pounders captured from British forces, along with purchased weapons, well into the 1950s. The Americans abandoned the 57mm M1 more quickly, replacing it with 57mm recoilless rifles, and eventually with the M20 75mm recoilless rifle. By 1946, most American 57mm guns were in storage or had been scrapped. The lack of effective HE ammunition had crippled the gun's versatility in American service. But this was a failure of ammunition development, not the basic weapon design. British HE ammunition, while not ideal, was adequate for many tasks. The Americans simply never developed comparable ammunition in quantity. Looking back from the perspective of 80 years, the 6-pounder represents a fascinating case study in weapons development. Designed before the war as a replacement for an already inadequate gun, it was delayed by the desperate circumstances of 1940. By the time it entered service in 1942, it was exactly what British forces needed. For 18 months, from May 1942 to late 1943, it was the best Allied anti-tank gun in the Western theatres. The introduction of Tiger and Panther tanks challenged, but didn't eliminate its effectiveness. Development of APDS ammunition gave it new life against heavily armoured targets. Production of 35,000 guns ensured availability throughout the British Empire and to Allied forces. The gun's success stemmed from several factors. First, it was mechanically reliable. The design was simple, rugged, and maintainable under field conditions. Crews could perform most repairs with basic tools. The gun rarely jammed or malfunctioned. Second, it was powerful enough. While it couldn't frontally penetrate the heaviest German tanks with standard ammunition, it could destroy them with flank shots or APDS rounds. Against the vast majority of German armour, Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, Stug IIIs, and Marders, it was completely effective. Third, it was man-portable. 6 men could break down the gun and carry it short distances. A light vehicle could tow it across rough terrain. This made it suitable for airborne and infantry use, roles where heavier guns simply couldn't go. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, it arrived when desperately needed. The dark days of 1941 and early 1942, when British tanks and anti-tank guns were hopelessly outclassed, gave way to the summer of 1942 when the 6-pounder provided a genuine answer to German armour. This psychological impact cannot be overstated. British troops who had spent years watching their shots bounce off enemy tanks suddenly had a weapon that worked. Confidence soared, tactics improved, training focused on using the gun effectively rather than surviving its inadequacy. The 6-pounder didn't just destroy German tanks, it restored British faith in their ability to fight German armour on equal terms. At various museums and military bases around the world, preserved 6-pounders sit on display. The Imperial War Museum in London has several examples. The Tank Museum at Bovington displays 6-pounders alongside the tanks they fought against, including Tiger 131, still bearing the marks where 6-pounder rounds struck its armour. In Canada, the Canadian War Museum preserves Canadian-manufactured guns. In Australia, the Australian War Memorial maintains examples used in the Pacific Theatre. In Israel, captured British 6-pounders sit in armour museums, reminders of the gun service in multiple armies over multiple decades. These weapons, silent now, once roared across the deserts of North Africa, the beaches of Normandy, the mountains of Italy, and the plains of northwest Europe. They destroyed thousands of enemy tanks. They saved countless Allied lives. They helped win the war. The 6-pounder's story is ultimately one of timing and adaptation. It arrived late, after being delayed by circumstances beyond anyone's control. But when it finally reached the front lines, it proved exactly what was needed. As German armour improved, the gun adapted through better ammunition rather than wholesale replacement. When heavier weapons became available, the 6-pounder didn't disappear but found new roles where its combination of firepower and portability remained valuable. For paratroopers dropping behind enemy lines, for infantry battalions in close terrain, for armoured car crews needing something more powerful than a machine gun, the 6-pounder continued serving long after larger guns had replaced it in pure anti-tank roles. This versatility, combined with mechanical reliability and effectiveness, made it one of the most successful weapons of its type in military history. The German gunners who faced it at Gazala, at El Alamein, in Tunisia, in Italy, and in France learned to respect and fear it. The British, Commonwealth, and American troops who operated it trusted it with their lives. That mutual respect between users and opponents is perhaps the finest tribute any weapon can receive. The 6-pounder earned it in blood and fire across 3 continents and 5 years of war. The gun's tactical employment evolved significantly as the war progressed. In 1942, British doctrine called for anti-tank guns to be positioned in depth, creating multiple defensive lines that attacking armour would have to penetrate. The 6-pounder fit this doctrine perfectly. Its relatively compact size allowed it to be dug into concealed positions more easily than larger weapons. The 2-man trails could be spread wide for stability, then closed quickly if the gun needed to be moved. In the desert, where natural concealment was scarce, crews became experts at using the slightest terrain features. A small depression, barely noticeable to the naked eye, could hide a 6-pounder until enemy tanks closed to point-blank range. Sergeant James Donaldson of the 260th Anti-Tank Battery described the process of preparing a gun position in North Africa. You'd find your spot, usually on a slight rise with good fields of fire. Then you'd dig like your life depended on it, because it did. The gun pit had to be deep enough to lower the weapon's silhouette, but shallow enough to allow full traverse. We'd pile rocks and sand around the position for additional protection. Camouflage netting went over the top. Then you'd wait, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, watching the heat shimmer on the sand and hoping the Germans would drive into your killing zone. When they did, you had to make every shot count. Miss, and they'd spot your muzzle flash. Then the artillery would come, and you'd either be dead or running. The mathematics of anti-tank gunnery were brutal and precise. At 500 yards, a moving Panzer IV presented a target approximately 20 feet long and 10 feet high. The gun's accuracy at this range was excellent, but the target was moving at perhaps 15 miles per hour, requiring significant lead. Gunners learned to estimate range by eye, calculate deflection instinctively, and fire in the brief moments when their sight picture was perfect. A well-trained crew could fire 5 aimed shots per minute. In practice, combat rates were lower due to stress, dust, smoke, and the constant threat of enemy fire. 3 shots per minute was more realistic. This meant every shot had to count. The psychological strain on anti-tank gunners was immense. Unlike infantry who could take cover when threatened, gun crews had to remain at their weapons. Running meant abandoning expensive equipment and betraying your position. Staying meant facing multi-ton machines armed with cannon and machine guns while you crouched behind a steel shield barely half an inch thick. The 6-pounder's gun shield provided some protection against small arms and shrapnel, but it was useless against tank cannon. Crews learned quickly that survival depended on killing enemy tanks before they located your position. This created an almost unbearable tension. Fire too early, and you'd reveal your position before achieving decisive results. Wait too long, and the enemy would spot you anyway and kill you first. Lieutenant Peter Vaux, of the 4th Light Armoured Brigade, described watching 6-pounder crews in action during the breakout from El Alamein. We were advancing with our tanks when German armour appeared on our flank. The anti-tank guns were positioned in a wadi we'd passed minutes earlier. I watched through binoculars as 3 6-pounders opened fire simultaneously. The German tanks, I think they were Panzer IIIs, were caught completely by surprise. All 3 were hit within seconds. One exploded immediately. The other 2 tried to reverse but bogged down in soft sand. The 6-pounders kept firing methodically. Within a minute, all 3 German tanks were burning. The gun crews never moved, never panicked, just loaded and fired like they were on a training range. Then German artillery started landing around them. We lost sight of the position in the smoke and dust. When we advanced through that area later, I found 2 of the 3 guns destroyed, the crews dead at their weapons, but they'd stopped the German flanking attack cold. In Italy, the mountainous terrain created unique challenges for 6-pounder employment. The guns were too heavy to manhandle up steep slopes, but roads were often mined or under observation by German artillery. The solution came from unexpected sources. Mules, the traditional pack animals of Italian agriculture, proved capable of carrying disassembled 6-pounders up mountain tracks where vehicles couldn't go. Each gun would be broken into components: barrel, breech mechanism, trails, wheels and shield, then distributed among several mules. At the top, crews would reassemble the weapon and prepare fighting positions. This allowed British and Commonwealth forces to position anti-tank guns in locations the Germans considered impossible, creating nasty surprises for counterattacking panzers. The Italian campaign also saw increased use of 6-pounders in direct fire support roles against fortifications. German defensive positions in Italy were formidable, utilising medieval stone buildings, concrete bunkers, and natural cave systems. High explosive ammunition was preferred for this work, but the 6-pounder's limited HE capability meant armour-piercing rounds were often used instead. At close range, an AP round would punch clean through stone walls, the solid shot creating a shower of stone fragments on the far side that was often more deadly than explosive shells. Gunners learned to target window openings, doorways and wall corners where the structural damage would be most significant. A 6-pounder firing AP shot could systematically demolish a stone building in minutes. Major Sidney Jari, who commanded an infantry company during the Italian campaign, noted the versatility of attached 6-pounders. They were officially anti-tank guns, but we used them for everything: bunker busting, knocking out machine gun nests, creating breaches in walls for assault teams. I once watched a 6-pounder crew engage a German sniper position in a church bell tower. They put 3 rounds through the bell tower opening at about 800 yards. The tower collapsed, and we didn't have any more sniper problems from that direction. The crews hated using their guns this way because it revealed positions and attracted attention, but in close terrain, they often had no choice. The Normandy invasion in June 1944 represented the largest single deployment of 6-pounders in any operation. British and Canadian forces landed with 6-pounder anti-tank guns in virtually every infantry battalion. The US airborne divisions brought their 57mm guns by glider. The first guns ashore were landed directly on the beaches from landing craft, their crews wading through surf while under fire. Casualties among gun crews on D-Day were severe, particularly at Omaha Beach, where American forces faced the strongest opposition. At Sword Beach, where British forces landed, 6-pounders were in action within hours, engaging German counterattacks by elements of the 21st Panzer Division. The bocage country of Normandy, with its thick hedgerows and narrow lanes, proved nightmarish terrain for all anti-tank operations. Visibility was measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards. German tanks could approach to point-blank range before being spotted. The 6-pounder's lack of an effective HE round was particularly frustrating in this terrain, as gun crews needed to suppress German infantry in the hedgerows, but could only use solid shot. Some crews resorted to firing AP rounds into the base of hedgerows, hoping the impact would create enough shock and fragmentation to injure or suppress enemy infantry. This was wasteful and largely ineffective, but it was better than doing nothing. The close-range nature of bocage fighting did favour the 6-pounder in one respect. At ranges under 200 yards, even standard AP ammunition could penetrate almost any armour at any angle. Crews positioned at crossroads or in farmyards could wait until German tanks were literally on top of them before firing. These point-blank ambushes were terrifying for both sides. German tank crews had no time to react. British gun crews knew they'd get exactly one shot before every German weapon in range opened fire on their position. Survival rates were appalling, but the tactic worked. Panzer attacks into the hedgerows were repeatedly stopped cold by 6-pounders that seemed to materialise from nowhere, destroy a tank or two, then disappear into the landscape. Private John Longdon, a rifleman in the 7th Battalion, Hampshire Regiment, witnessed a 6-pounder ambush near Tilly-sur-Seulles on June 18, 1944. We were dug in on one side of a lane, watching this 6-pounder crew on the other side. They'd positioned their gun in a gap in the hedgerow, perfectly concealed. You couldn't see it from 20 feet away. We heard the tanks coming, that distinctive rumble of panzers moving through the lanes. The gunners didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. Then this Panzer IV came around the corner moving slow because the driver couldn't see more than a few yards ahead. The 6-pounder fired from maybe 50 yards. The shot went in just below the turret ring. The tank stopped dead. Smoke poured out of every hatch and vision port. The second tank in column tried to reverse but couldn't, because of the lane width. The 6-pounder fired again. Another hit. Another burning tank. The Germans must have had infantry back in the column because machine gun fire tore into the hedgerows. The gun crew fired a third shot at the second tank, which was well and truly ablaze by now, then abandoned their gun and ran. Smart lads. Seconds later, German artillery plastered that gun position with everything they had. When it was over, the gun was in pieces and the hedgerow was on fire, but 2 Panzer IVs were burning wrecks blocking the lane. As the Allied advance broke out of Normandy in August 1944, the nature of the fighting changed. Mobile warfare returned, and the 6-pounder's limitations became more apparent. In fluid situations, the 17-pounder's superior range and penetration made it the preferred weapon for Royal Artillery anti-tank regiments. The 6-pounder increasingly became an infantry weapon, kept at battalion level for close defence. This role suited it well. Infantry battalions didn't need guns that could kill Panthers at 2,000 yards. They needed weapons that could stop enemy armour at the ranges where infantry operated, typically under 800 yards. For this mission, the 6-pounder remained entirely adequate. The autumn and winter of 1944 saw 6-pounders employed in defensive positions as the Allied advance slowed. In the Netherlands, British XXX Corps found itself fighting through a landscape of canals, dikes and flooded fields. The 6-pounder's relatively lightweight made it easier to position on soft ground than heavier guns. Crews learned to build firing platforms from wooden planks and sandbags to distribute weight and prevent the gun from sinking into the mud. These semi-permanent positions allowed gunners to pre-register ranges and prepare precise firing data for likely approach routes. When German counterattacks came, as they inevitably did, the 6-pounders were ready. Operation Market Garden, the ambitious airborne operation to seize bridges in the Netherlands, saw extensive use of 6-pounders by British and Polish airborne forces. The 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem was equipped with 6-pounders, though many guns were lost when their gliders crashed or landed in the wrong locations. The guns that did reach their intended positions proved valuable in the desperate fighting around Arnhem Bridge and the Oosterbeek perimeter. At ranges measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards, the 6-pounder could destroy any German vehicle. Several accounts describe 6-pounders firing down streets at German tanks and self-propelled guns, the solid shot ricocheting off cobblestones in showers of sparks before striking their targets. Sergeant Lewis Payne of the 1st Air Landing Anti-Tank Battery described the fighting at Oosterbeek. We'd positioned our gun covering a road junction. German armour kept trying to push through to cut us off. We knocked out 3 or 4 vehicles. I lost count after a while. The problem wasn't killing them. At that range, we couldn't miss, and they couldn't survive. The problem was ammunition. We'd landed with maybe 30 rounds per gun. By the 3rd day, we were down to single digits. We had to let targets pass until we had a clear shot at something important. A half-track full of infantry wasn't worth a round. A Stug 3 trying to position for direct fire was worth 2 rounds to make sure we killed it. When we finally ran out of ammunition, we disabled the gun and joined the infantry in the perimeter. They gave us rifles and told us to start acting like riflemen, which was fine, except we were anti-tank gunners, not riflemen. We did our best. The winter of 1944 and 1945 was brutal for Allied forces, particularly during the Battle of the Bulge. German armoured spearheads punched through American lines in the Ardennes, creating panic and confusion. American 57mm guns found themselves engaging German armour in conditions they'd never trained for: blizzards, forests, and terrain that limited visibility to less than 100 yards. The gun performed adequately when it could be brought to bear, but many crews found their guns bypassed by German armour, advancing through forests where wheeled guns couldn't follow. The lack of effective HE ammunition was again a critical limitation. Crews needed to engage German infantry in the woods, but had only armour-piercing ammunition designed for penetrating tanks. British forces, holding the northern shoulder of the Bulge, employed their 6-pounders more successfully. Fighting from prepared positions with good fields of fire, British anti-tank guns stopped repeated German armoured probes. The APDS ammunition, though still in limited supply, proved its worth against Panther and Tiger tanks that had terrorised American forces. At ranges under 1,000 yards, APDS gave 6-pounder crews a fighting chance against even the heaviest German armour. Confidence remained high. German forces shifted their attacks toward American sectors, where resistance was less organised. By early 1945, the war was entering its final phase. Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced into Germany itself. German resistance, while still fierce in places, was increasingly disorganised. Fuel shortages meant German armour was often immobilised. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective force. The 6-pounder crews found themselves engaging less armour and more improvised strongpoints, hastily organised defensive positions that the crumbling Wehrmacht threw together in attempts to slow the Allied advance. The gun's limitations in this role were frustrating, but crews made do. If you couldn't blow up a building with HE, you could at least punch holes in it with AP shot. The final weeks of the war saw some of the strangest 6-pounder engagements. At the Elbe River, British units encountered German forces that wanted to surrender to the Western Allies, rather than face the Soviets advancing from the east. 6-pounder crews found themselves guarding German tanks and armoured vehicles that had been turned, over intact by their crews. In Austria, British forces accepted the surrender of entire German armoured formations, their vehicles parked neatly in fields while 6-pounders covered them from prepared positions. The guns that had spent years destroying German armour now stood guard over it. VE Day, May 8, 1945, marked the end of the war in Europe. For 6-pounder crews, it meant the end of 3 years of combat. The guns that had fought from Gazala to the Elbe, from El Alamein to the Baltic, were finally silent. Many guns were simply abandoned in place, no longer needed and too expensive to ship home. Others were turned over to Allied nations re-establishing their militaries. Some were shipped back to Britain for storage or eventual scrapping. A fortunate few were preserved for training or museum display. The post-war analysis of the 6-pounder's effectiveness made for interesting reading. British operational research examined the gun's combat record across all theatres. The conclusions were generally favourable. The 6-pounder had provided adequate anti-tank capability throughout the critical period from 1942 to 1944. Against German tanks except Tigers and Panthers, it remained effective throughout the war. With APDS ammunition, it could engage even heavy armour with reasonable prospects of success. Its mechanical reliability was excellent, with failure rates far below comparable weapons. Crew training was simpler than for larger guns. Logistics were manageable. The gun had done what was asked of it. The weaknesses were also documented. The lack of effective HE ammunition severely limited versatility. The gun was heavy for infantry use but lacked the range and penetration of dedicated anti-tank guns like the 17-pounder. Its performance against sloped armour was inferior to guns using higher velocity ammunition. In the final analysis, the 6-pounder was judged a successful interim weapon that had bridged the gap between inadequate 2-pounders and superior 17-pounders. This was accurate if somewhat understated. The 6-pounder hadn't just filled a gap, it had won battles. The gun's continued service after the war demonstrated its enduring utility. In 1948, when the British Army was being rapidly demobilised and budgets were tight, the 6-pounder remained standard equipment for infantry battalions. The 17-pounder was retained in specialised anti-tank regiments, but the 6-pounder's combination of adequate performance and low cost made it ideal for basic anti-tank defence. Infantry officers trained in the late 1940s learned their anti-tank gunnery on 6-pounders, just as their predecessors had in 1942. The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, saw 6-pounders deployed with Commonwealth forces. The gun proved effective against North Korean T-34 ATS tanks, though American 90mm guns and Centurion tanks with 20-pounders provided most anti-tank capability. The 6-pounder's role was primarily defensive, protecting supply areas and headquarters locations against possible armoured incursions. The gun never saw the intensive combat it had experienced in World War II, but its presence provided reassurance that infantry battalions had organic anti-tank capability without relying solely on supporting arms. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was the last combat deployment of British 6-pounders. Egyptian forces, equipped with Soviet armour, faced British and French forces during the short, sharp conflict over the Suez Canal. British infantry units still carried 6-pounders as battalion anti-tank weapons. The gun saw limited action, as Egyptian armour was generally engaged by Centurion tanks and airstrikes before infantry positions came under direct attack. Still, the 6-pounders were there, ready to fight if needed. 14 years after Gazala, the gun remained in frontline service. The final retirement came in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The development of effective anti-tank guided missiles rendered conventional anti-tank guns obsolescent. The British MOBAT, missile on-board anti-tank, and later Vigilant missile systems could be carried by infantry and could destroy any tank at ranges far exceeding what gun systems could achieve. The 6-pounder, along with the 17-pounder and other towed anti-tank guns, was declared surplus. Most were scrapped. Some went to reserve units for training. A few were preserved for museums or military displays. The gun's influence extended beyond British service. The American 57mm M1 was used extensively by US forces and was supplied to Allied nations through Lend-Lease. After the war, American M1 guns were provided to Latin American countries, to NATO allies, and to various nations under military aid programs. Some served into the 1970s in armies that couldn't afford or didn't need more modern weapons. A 57mm gun that could destroy the tanks of the 1970s, typically older Soviet exports or World War II relics, remained useful in regional conflicts and internal security roles. The Israelis, with their characteristic ingenuity, kept 6-pounders in service longer than most nations. Captured British guns supplemented by purchased weapons formed part of Israeli anti-tank defences in the 1948 War of Independence. Against Arab forces equipped with World War II-era armour, the 6-pounder remained effective. Some guns were mounted on half-tracks or trucks for mobile operations. The Israelis developed their own ammunition when British supplies ran out. By the 1956 Sinai campaign, most 6-pounders had been replaced by more modern weapons, but some remained in service with second-line units into the 1960s. The technical specifications of the 6-pounder tell part of the story but not all of it. Yes, it weighed 2,520 pounds. Yes, it fired a 6.28-pound projectile at 2,693 feet per second. Yes, it could penetrate 74 millimeters at 1,000 yards with standard AP and 146 millimeters with APDS. But these numbers don't capture what the gun meant to the men who operated it. For British gunners in 1942, it meant the difference between helplessness and effectiveness. For German tankers, it meant a new threat that required respect and caution. For infantry soldiers, it meant protection against armour that had previously seemed unstoppable. The human stories behind the gun reveal its true impact. Sergeant Calistan at Snipe firing until his gun ran out of ammunition, while Italian tanks advanced to point-blank range. Lieutenant Edwards in Tunisia, scoring the first kill against a Tiger. The unknown gunner who fired the shots that disabled Tiger 131, preserving it for future generations. Private Longdon's comrades in Normandy, ambushing panzers at 50 yards in the Bocage. Sergeant Payne at Arnhem, rationing ammunition while holding off German counterattacks. These men, and thousands like them, made the 6-pounder effective through their skill, courage and determination. The gun's legacy extends to modern military thinking about anti-tank warfare. The 6-pounder demonstrated that effective anti-tank defence required weapons that could actually destroy enemy armour, not merely harass it. This seems obvious now, but wasn't always accepted in the 1930s and early 1940s, when some military theorists argue that tanks should fight tanks, while anti-tank guns merely suppressed them. The brutal combat of 1942 to 1945 proved that anti-tank guns needed sufficient power to kill tanks outright. This lesson influenced post-war development of anti-tank weapons, leading to increasingly powerful guns and eventually to guided missiles. The 6-pounder also demonstrated the importance of ammunition development. The gun's effectiveness more than doubled with the introduction of APDS rounds. This wasn't a new gun. It was the same weapon with better ammunition. Modern anti-tank systems place enormous emphasis on ammunition performance for exactly this reason. A mediocre gun with excellent ammunition can outperform an excellent gun with mediocre ammunition. The 6-pounder proved this principle in combat. The gun's mechanical reliability set standards that influenced subsequent British weapons design. The simple, rugged construction that allowed the 6-pounder to function in desert sand, Italian mud, Norman rain, and Dutch snow became a hallmark of British ordnance. Later weapons like the L7 105mm tank gun and L16 81mm mortar shared this emphasis on reliability over complexity. If you design a weapon that works every time in any conditions, soldiers will trust it. Trust translates to confidence. Confidence wins battles. At the various military museums where 6-pounders are displayed, visitors can examine the weapon up close. The gun is smaller than expected. The shield seems inadequate. The sights look crude compared to modern optical systems. The entire weapon appears almost toy-like next to modern anti-tank missiles and main battle tanks. But the elderly veterans who sometimes visit these museums, men who operated these guns in combat 7 or 8 decades ago, see something different. They see the weapon that gave them a fighting chance. They remember the weight of the shells, the kick of the recoil, the acrid smell of burned propellant, and the satisfaction of watching enemy tanks burn. They remember comrades who died at these guns, and comrades who survived because these guns protected them. The 6-pounder anti-tank gun was never the most powerful weapon of World War II. It wasn't the most advanced or the most famous. It arrived late, after being delayed by circumstances. It had significant limitations, particularly the lack of effective high-explosive ammunition. But it was exactly what British and Commonwealth forces needed when they needed it. From the desperate days of 1942, when Rommel seemed unstoppable, through the grinding campaigns in Italy and France, to the final victory in 1945, the 6-pounder destroyed thousands of enemy vehicles and saved countless Allied lives. For 3 years of intensive combat and 15 more years of reserve service, it served with distinction. That service, spanning 2 decades and multiple continents, stands as testament to sound design, robust engineering, and the courage of the men who operated it. The 6-pounder stopped German armour cold when stopping it mattered most. No weapon can claim greater success.